Welcome to Energy Insights. Today we're speaking with Liming Qiao, the Asia Director at the Global Wind Energy Council, or GWEC. Today Liming and I discuss lots of topics, including the goal of tripling renewable energy capacity and if it's even possible, what supply chain bottlenecks there are for renewable rollouts in Asia, what governments and the private sector can do to incentivize secured supply chains, the challenges of job losses in the fossil fuel industry as the world shifts to renewables and how clean energy can offset those losses, and GWEC's APAC Wind Energy Summit later this year. Liming's been working on climate and energy policy since 2003 and has worked with major industry and institutional stakeholders that are active across Southeast Asia in the renewable energy sector. She's also worked with other international organisations and has participated in climate negotiations as an observer for several years. It was great to have Liming on the show, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, so we are here with Liming Qiao. Liming, thank you so much for coming on Energy Insights.
Thanks for having me.
So Liming, before we get started, I'm just wondering if you can give listeners a brief background on who you are, where you work, and anything else that you think is relevant.
Okay, so I'm Liming. I'm head of Asia for Global Wind Energy Council. And maybe first to start introducing what is Global Wind Energy Council, GWEC. GWEC is the Wind Energy Trade Association. We basically represent the whole wind energy industry. And being the wind or renewable energy, clean energy industry representation, that means we mainly do two things. One is to represent the wind energy at different international policy forums. And these different policy forums, including UNFCCC, their annual COP, Conference of the Party, events, or we represent the wind energy at different interactions with International Renewable Energy Agency or International Energy Agency, being recognized by them as the representation of the clean energy industry. So our other mission is really to help the wind industry to open up new markets. And the new markets definition keep growing, keep expanding. Like 10 or 12 years ago, the new markets that we work heavily on, China, India, Brazil, these nowadays renewable energy leaders. And with them becoming the renewable energy leaders nowadays, we move into new frontiers like offshore wind sector, or we move into new emerging markets like Southeast Asia or Latin America, the rest of the Latin, or the rest of Asia, of Middle East and Africa. So basically, that's what we do. So being the head of Asia, I'm leading the work in East Asia, especially focusing on the offshore wind development nowadays, and also the Southeast Asia for both onshore and offshore markets. And personally, I've been working for climate and energy issue for 20 years. And that is, in the beginning, very much focused on international climate policies or the UNFCCC kind of climate processes. But the past 10 plus or 10 to 15 years, more focused on the renewable energy policies in Asia, looking at all these emerging markets and how do we really put a policy frameworks into these markets and kick off the wind energy development.
Great.
So that's me.
Yeah, no, speaking of all of those developments, I mean, you've mentioned some of those big players like in Asia, especially like the Chinas and the Indias. So I would like to talk about a lot of that, and also the renewable energy supply chain across Southeast Asia as well, and of course Asia in general, if we can get there as well. But I'm just wondering if we can first talk about this new, I mean, it's not new, but it's gathered a lot of attention lately, and it's this idea of tripling renewable energy capacity by 2030. So I'm just wondering if you can kind of give us from your perspective, where this number came from, and just how important that is from a global context, not even just Asia, if we zoom out into the globe.
So I think the concept first started to emerge in some of the models in the IEA and IRENA reports, and then later was published in like the IEA and IRENA's, they separately have the net zero report by 2050, and where we first started to see this concept being mentioned as how do we, as a way of making the climate goal of net zero into an energy policy goal. If we talk about the scenario of tripling renewables by 2030 for a 1.5 degree pathway, it was actually already locked into the net zero scenario modeled by IEA and IRENA, and it was published as early as 2021 in these two international organizations' net zero by 2050 reports, respectively. But it really started to gather the political momentum as a pledge of triple renewable energy and doubling of the energy efficiency. These two actually are coming together following a G7 meeting in the early 2023, and then was becoming a call for action by the leaders like European Commission President and later by the COP28 President. So in that sequence, it gradually gained momentum, and it gradually grew from a modeling kind of like result or recommendation into entering into a political kind of arena, and in the end become what we see today, like last year at the end of the COP, the pledge of 19 countries committed to this. But then when it comes to why this is important, or what's the importance of this, it's actually quite useful and really is significant in a way. It turned a climate goal or very aspirational kind of climate ambition, which is net zero, into a very tangible and implementable energy policy goal. And that land onto the clean energy deployment, which is the triple of the renewables, and the energy efficiency goal, which is the double of the energy efficiency goal. So in a way, it makes the climate goal very, very much easy to handle, easy to grasp, and easy to be put into an implementation mode. So that's the significance of it.
Now, if we do talk about tripling renewable energy, the capacity by 2030, I mean, that is not too far away. It's only 6 years away now. Of course, you have to have a lot of infrastructure build out to make this happen as well. So I'm wondering, from your work, have you been able to look at, also Asia, but also Southeast Asia's renewable energy sector right now? Like, what's it looking like right now? Is it well on the way to kind of achieving those numbers, or do you think that there's still quite a bit of work to be done?
This is a very good question. I think to answer it, a quick answer is that there are still a lot to be done. But what the good thing or the positive thing is that we've seen a number of the government is already started to realize that that's the goal, that's the way to go, and trying to put their country's medium-term energy development plan into something that can really matching that goal. So what we've seen is that at first, the basis of tripling renewables is actually the net zero by the middle of the century. And what we've seen is that a number of the countries in Southeast Asia region actually already adopted this or already embraced the concept like a few years ago, like a couple of years ago, before the triple of renewables becoming like politically recognized as we see today. And those countries that took the kind of like the first step of embracing the net zero goal were like Vietnam, Indonesia, and also Thailand back in 2021 at COP26. And then in the past year or the past 2 years, we see some of these countries further translate this kind of commitment into like the partnership of the Just Transition Energy Partnership, the JETP process, which gives a lot of boost for facilitating this energy transition. So those are more like the international level of the things. But for some of the countries which never really like officially committed to like net zero, like in the global policy arena, like the Philippines, we continue to see them also take their own pace of like announcing their own energy transition kind of like resolution or their plans, like the moratorium of the new coal in the Philippines. And so basically, if you look at the major economies in Southeast Asia, somehow, somewhere, that bigger commitment, that bigger recognition of the future energy paths need to be driven by energy transition. That recognition is there. That's the fundamental, the baseline. And then if you look at what steps these countries actually take to make it happen, it's actually even more positive. A number of the countries do recognize high share of renewables is the way to go. And a number of the countries also recognize that in this transition pathway, if they have the resources like offshore wind, this is also the technology for you to really seriously deliver that net zero goal. And some of them, by introducing them with a high target in the power development plan, and by doing that, make it happen already is the case. Like in the Vietnam, we've seen a target for 6 gigawatt of offshore being put into the power development plan in the beginning of last year. And same thing for onshore target being introduced in a number of the countries by 2030. All this kind of like bigger ambitious for 2030 or 2050 kind of like net zero goal in the end turned into 2030 tangible renewable energy development plan is what we've seen in a number of the countries in the region. So in terms of that, I think that's really a positive thing.
Now this, of course, it talking about all these countries' ambitions and their growing ambitions as well, and also their current rollouts of whatever their policies are prescribing, it brings me to think about the supply chain of all these materials and of course like the electricity grids and of course like building wind turbines, for example. Now, what does this look like for Asia right now? I'm just thinking about elsewhere in the world where you have some supply chain issues with especially the wind industry in for example in Europe. Now they're going through a bit of a slump there. I'm just wondering if that has kind of come over to Asia, or if Asia is experiencing similar problems, or do you think that this is really a temporary thing that will eventually solve itself?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because supply chain is indeed one of the biggest topic right now going on for the industry. And I think before we jump into answering that question of like where Asia sits, let's first put this whole race for clean energy into a global context. This whole race to net zero and the race to deployment of clean energy is global. It's happening in Asia in a big way, like we just described, but it's also happening in Europe, in US, in all these bigger major economies around the world. What does it mean? It means that this renewable energy, clean energy deployment for wind, for offshore wind, is happening almost at the same time in this decade, or in the second, especially in the second half of this decade. So that gives you the bigger picture of suddenly the demand is really high at one time, at the same time, globally. And then that being the bigger global context, then let's look at the supply chain picture. When we talk about supply chain, when we talk about wind energy supply chain, what are we talking about? Wind energy does have a very long chain on the supply chain. It basically covers, like, if we talk about the categories, raw material, such as the critical mineral, which is really critical for this industry, and some of that, like rare earths, the copper, and others, and to the different components, such as the gearbox, the generator, the blades, the transmitter, converter, tower, foundation, cable, and also the assembly of the gearbox, the assembly processes, and that being like the component part, and as well as other enabling factors, especially when it comes to offshore, such as the vessels, installation vessels, the service vessels, plus even if you define it a little bit more broader, it can also have the port infrastructure being included under here, or even the workforce being included under here. Those are all the enabling factors that can either enable it to happen or constrain it to happen if there is no enough capacity. So if we're looking at this whole long chain of things, and to be honest, if we're talking about the second half of the decade, the whole chain is under a very, very big stress kind of test for globally. And in Asia, this race is serious and really true. And especially if we were talking about the offshore, if we look at the Asia countries outside China, outside India, a number of the Southeast Asia countries or East Asia countries all have very ambitious offshore targets, like 10 gigawatt in Japan by 2030, 14 gigawatt by Korea by 2030, 15.5 by 2035 in Taiwan, and 6 each in Vietnam and the Philippines. And if we look at the Asia picture, we actually are taking China and India in the picture. If we take China and India in the picture, then the supply chain kind of like challenge or the bottleneck is not that serious. Why? Because China and India actually holds the best kind of concentration on the supply chain solutions. But if we're talking about them providing solutions to their own growth, and then looking at the rest of the Asia, the picture is really challenging. And that's what we're talking about. And if we look at the rest of Asia, the rest of Asia, which means Asia minus China, minus India, the supply chain capacity is quite weak. And if we're talking about the capacity to meet what we're talking about of all those targets by 2030, the way to go is really long. And that is the signal that for us as GWEC, talking to various different governments in the region, that has been the signal that we keep telling the different governments supply chain will be the bottleneck. Now is the time to wake up. If we started the investment, there's still some time left between now and like in the middle or second half of this decade. Let's wake up and started the investment, started the rolling of the supply chain building in this region.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, how do you see governments playing a bigger role in securing these supply chains, especially for countries, as you mentioned, that are outside of India and China that aren't producing their own supplies, right? I mean, for example, I know Singapore is small, but Singapore doesn't have any sort of kind of domestic energy kind of producing infrastructure, right? It imports most of its stuff. Like, what role does government play in this? Is there a role for these governments to play to make these relationships stronger, these policies stronger, and I guess, getting things in line and getting things in order so that they can reach their targets?
This is also something that GWEC actually has been looking into. How do we encourage the supply chain development in the region? How do I bring the regional or national government into a more constructive way of looking at supply chain build-up? And what are the right policy, sectoral policy that should be introduced to encourage the supply chain development? A few key message there or a few key things there. Number one is that supply chain is being usually and mainly invested by the private sector. But to ensure the private sector's investment is into this, the number one thing is to ensure that there is a future that you can give to the investors. There is a renewable energy project pipeline in the region or in this country or at a national, regional, or global level. That signal should be strong and clear and should be given as early as possible. And secondly is the supply chain development kind of plan, which including a few things: mapping of the needs, mapping of the existing supply chain, and corresponding this to identify the gaps. And then interaction with the stakeholders. That stakeholders can be the private sector, can be the local government, local stakeholders, other people, to kind of identify what's really needed, what's really the best way to mobilize like the investment, and also to identify the locations. All this need to be happen like holistically, and all this becoming the key points that substantiate a supply chain development plan. And then also to look into the incentive mechanism. Is there any existing incentive mechanism for the industry or do we need additional incentive mechanism for the clean energy industry? And then also design different other programs to give the workforce enough training, enough other things that can also enable the whole build-up of the supply chain. I think this 4-ish points probably can compose the main things that is required for the government to kick off the supply chain kind of development or sectoral kind of supply development.
Do you think there's more of a role for the private sector? And I mean, how do you incentivize the private sector to get more involved in helping the government do all this? Because, taking into account that the private sector does, already, juggle most of the globe's trade and supply chains.
I think that's why I mentioned the stakeholder engagement or the dialogue between the government and the private sector is quite important and quite crucial in a number of the markets that successfully have been through this whole journey. And another thing which I think I also forgot to mention in the government's role is also like some of the things which is also part of the incentives. In Asia, there is a particular kind of preference for local content requirement policy to be installed into the supply chain or into the energy policy. And we've seen some of the really successful kind of clean energy deployment countries or markets that have been using the local content requirement rules to an extreme extent that's very prescriptive, very limiting, and in the end becoming not effective, but something as a bad example almost for the industry supply chain policy. And that's something that we don't want to see happen. So there are also lots of lessons or lots of lessons that need to be drawn from these kind of negative cases that need to be widely circulated among the Asia kind of groups or countries to make sure that we're not replicating the same mistake again. But back to your questions, what should the private sector do? And I think number one is that all those things about government giving the incentive, the private sector need to play its part, which is to respond to the policies and actually to really do the investment. But back to your questions, how to make sure that the incentive policy really works is that dialogue process that I just mentioned is really important. If we can ensure the dialogue and as a process is being introduced, and then the incentive policy is being created based on the dialogues, really reflects the industry needs, then it's private sector's role to play as the next part, which is to basically bring the investment, make it happen. But I think private sector also can play more roles in terms of research and development, in terms of innovation, R&D, in terms of education, training of the workforce. But that the last part on the education and training of the workforce should, in the very beginning, also have some government to play some role in that whole process, like a government and private sector kind of partnership to build a more solid workforce to kind of kick off the whole process. So I think if we can have all these three elements, it should be good.
So in a perfect world, if all of these three elements, for example, lined up in a perfect world, what would the economic benefit be for Asia if the tripling of renewables was genuinely achieved?
It's actually hard to give a number to say how it would really look like, but maybe this can lead to us or me giving you a small advertisement of some reports, like 2 reports that will very soon to be released, which is actually to look into one market, the Korean market, on the economic benefits of offshore wind. If it really happens, what economic benefit can be brought into the coastal region? And we look into one market, but use some of the European cases as a reference, and also did some modeling to see exactly how much job creation, socioeconomic benefits can really be generated here. So those reports will be released pretty soon, but that can give you a kind of like sneak peek or an overview of how those socioeconomic benefits really can be from a market level, and further you can extrapolate those and apply that to the regional level.
So I did want to also talk about some challenges that Asia's facing right now as well, Liming. For example, one challenge I can think of is the example of, for example, gas. Now, gas in a lot of countries, the infrastructure is already there, the supply chains are already pretty solid, and a lot of Asian countries already look at gas as a transition fuel as they're moving away from coal. Do you see gas affecting this tripling of renewable energy's ambition, or just in general renewable energy rollout, or do you see it kind of scaling back going into the future?
That's actually a really good question. I think maybe to frame it in another way, I think gas has been the gas industry has been putting themselves into a very comfortable position by framing them as a transitional technology. And by framing them as a transitional technology, they are also kind of like trying to push themselves into the cleaner side of the things, or not to be like associated with the fossil side of the thing, to be more precisely. And that's wrong. And fundamentally, it's also a type of fossil fuel. And it's a technology that is supposed to be phased out. And if we are talking about the net zero, we are talking about the net zero. And the net zero is to target the whole fossil industry, and that including gas. So no matter how gas is like repurposing itself, no matter how it's being called a transitional or whatever technology, it's a fossil fuel. It's part of the fossil fuel industry. And that means, to answer your question, is it a divert? Is it a diversion? Yes. How about using all this energy into like deployment of renewables? And especially after offshore wind are being brought into the picture, I think it fundamentally changed the whole narrative of what renewable energy is. Offshore wind energy actually is fundamentally different from all the other usual variable renewable energy technology. In a sense, it provides a very stable and highly predictable and low variability kind of like clean energy, renewable energy sources. In that sense, it basically can be the answer to lots of the challenges that the other industry or the fossil industry has been picking on the renewable or on the variable renewables, being not stable, being variable, and being not able to play that kind of like the base load kind of like role. And offshore wind, given its very high capacity factor, can reach in the range of 50s, and with the technology further improve, can further reaching higher number, is basically recognized by International Energy Agency as the only renewable energy baseload technology. So that fundamentally give us the confidence or give us the opportunity to basically say, yes, we can make it. We can make all this plus the hybridization of the other technology, the other renewable energy, plus the storage going forward, like with the cost reduction and others, that the net zero, the more high renewable energy kind of like future scenario is very possible, with just the clean energy being the backbone of it.
So one other little challenge that I think is quite important actually, and it doesn't really get talked about that much, is the current supply chain in the fossil fuel industry that employs so many people, especially in the lower socioeconomic side of the world, and which of course this brings me to the concept of a just energy transition. And I'm just wondering how important that is when we're talking about, for example, again, tripling renewable energy and moving away from fossil fuels, how important is it to look after those people who are suddenly, for example, out of work, if their coal power plant gets shut down, because it's been scaled back, because the fossil fuels being scaled back. Do you think that, for example, like just energy transition partnerships could help this kind of smoothen out this process where these, very big employers and the people that work there are slowly scaled back and they're maybe losing jobs?
This is another good question. And I think the just transition is a very important concept, and also probably one of the most critical issue that is facing our industry, because we're basically talking about phasing out of one whole industry or one whole technology or a few different sub-technologies under a bigger category. There are some already published a few years ago reports from IEA that show some very interesting statistics, which actually shows that the jobs being generated by clean energy technology can already offset all the jobs that has been lost in the transition processes from the fossil fuel industry. And that finding, actually, to me, when I first saw it a year ago, and that report was published even like a couple of years ago. And I think now, if we look at an update version, if there is an updated version of that, if we look at the updated number, the number should further confirm that trend in a bigger way, meaning that the generation of the clean energy job should be more than offset that of the energy being displaced from the fossil fuel sector. That should be the headline that we should see in the future when we talk about the just transition issues. But unfortunately, what is happening now is that people do not have an understanding of the message that I just talked about. Even if for myself, for a person who works for the clean energy industry, when I first see that number, when I first see that finding, it shocked me a little bit. I didn't know it already happened. And I didn't know it already happened like a couple of years ago. And the lack of that message being widely spread, being widely recognized, is actually shocking. Why is the story being told the other way? Why is it not being told like the clean energy way? And that is actually one of the things that I think the clean energy industry people should think of, and anybody who cares about this topic should also think about. It's about the narrative, it's about the framing of the issue. But coming back to what you were talking about, indeed, if we look at a project level, yes, there are people being displaced, being laid off. How can we make sure that those people who are associated with certain location, certain projects, really being displaced with the jobs, are being offered with a job? That level of the perfect matching of the just transition of clean energy technology job being provided specifically to those group of people, or those people associated with particular projects, is another layer of challenge. But I believe to answer that question, or to answer that level of challenge, the only way to do is a more wider deployment of clean energy, and more massive deployment of clean technology can provide you the answer to that. If there are clean energy projects or being just built around a like a fossil fuel energy plant, then you immediately can retrain those people and place them onto a clean energy project. But is clean energy really deployed in that fast manner? No. So it all goes back to how fast we can deploy clean energy technology, how fast we can provide the answers to ensure just transition can happen at every level, not at the bigger level, as I just said, reflected by the IEA report, but at a project level, more micro level on a day-to-day.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very important conversation, and like you said, I hope the narrative on that changes, because it is what you mentioned. It is possible. So Now, Liming, just being mindful of your time, I just also wanted to quickly get your take. And I know the Global Wind Energy Council is hosting a wind energy summit later this year. I'm just wondering if you can give us a kind of quick overview of what kind of topics do you think will come out of that, and can you remind everybody, what when it is and what's going to be on the agenda?
Yeah. So actually, this year we're going to host our APAC Wind Energy Summit. It will happen in Incheon in Korea on 26th to 28th of November. And the event theme is actually triple of renewables. How can we make it happen? How can we make it from ambition to action? And also look into how this can be translated into national policies for the APAC region, but also to see how can we drive up the finance, because finance is quite important for driving the investment. So those will be the key, and we'll have different sessions and different side events and different tracks. There will be also on the side an event dedicated for corporate sourcing for the APAC region, corporate renewable energy sourcing for APAC region, and also a finance forum or to be sit on the side to particularly look into the scaling up of the finance to meet the triple of renewable goal.
Great. And just before you leave, Liming, I'm just wondering if you can tell listeners that anywhere that they can follow your work or your organization's work, where can we find you?
Yeah, you can find myself on LinkedIn or find GWEC on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at Global Wind Energy Council. And you can also find some of the sessions recording from last year's APAC Summit on our YouTube channel, following the same name, Global Wind Energy Council. Or if you're on X, then follow up at GWEC Global Wind.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Liming. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
If you found this episode valuable, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, share it with your friends or colleagues, and visit our website at energytracker.asia for more. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time on Energy Insights.